aimed at connecting accurate scientific research on families with the public and with the press. So in addition to putting on workshops like this, our members serve as a source of scientific expertise for the press, and we publish and distribute several things ourselves as part of our mission to publicize the most up-to-date research on families, and many of our pieces get wide press coverage. One thing we publish is a fairly popular textbook and reader called Families as They Really Are. We just had a new edition come out earlier, I think it was this year. And we have 10 copies of the book in the back, and we're going to be having a silent auction over the course of today. So if you want to get a copy for really cheap, we're going to give it to the 10 highest bidders at 4:45 at the reception tonight. Unfortunately, we can't mail them, so if you're distant and not planning to stay for the reception, keep that in mind. We also publish weekly blog posts, and we're going to hear from the blog editor later today about how to write for our blog if you want to. We publish several brief reports and press releases on new research on families, and sometimes we bring together written symposiums of researchers who write about family issues. We recently launched an early scholars program in which early career family scholars are matched with mentors and attend virtual workshops, and then they're coming here today. We brought them in, and they're going to be giving a couple of talks later today as well. Some of our earlier workshops are available to CCF members and to view online on our YouTube channel, and we're also going to post videos of this conference and the workshops if you want to come back and view them later. If you're interested in joining CCF, only $100 for the membership, and that'll get you a membership through the end of 2025 at this point. And that helps support events like this so that we could hold them for free, which this one is. And it gives you access to our resources as well. It's actually been over 4 years since we last had a large public gathering like this. Our last big conference was in February 2020. And I remember on the airplane seeing a few people in masks and being like, if this pandemic keeps being a thing, maybe I should look into that. And since then, the world has changed in numerous ways. During the height of COVID, we decided to stop having conferences for a little bit because of, a pandemic. And during that time, we also decided to rethink the format of our conferences. We used to have a more traditional academic conference, and we wanted something that would be a little bit different and would work more for members. So we arrived at the format we see today, and last year, Richard Petz and Dan Carlson held a kind of pilot workshop that was invitation only, where researchers came together to talk about a theme and each gave 5-minute flash presentations. And then in the afternoon, they got together to work on a written symposium, which came out later last year. And that was on the theme of COVID and gender equality. So we're going to do something similar today. We're going to have short presentations in our morning panel, and the panel speakers are going to get together later this afternoon to work on a written symposium that we hope to put out based on this conference, workshop, I guess. The other thing we decided to change is to focus more on being a resource for training other people in doing public scholarship, since we have many people in the organization with a lot of expertise in that area. So in the afternoon today, we're going to have 4 speakers giving training on social media, podcasting, blog post writing, and turning your research into headlines. Then we'll break into roundtables, and even if you didn't sign up for one in advance, you are welcome to join the roundtables to learn about writing essays for the press or writing blog posts or brief reports. And after that, we'll have a wine and beer reception. So you should have gotten a drink ticket, hopefully, when you came in. And we'll give out our CCF awards, and we'll do the silent auction then, too. A little bit about the theme. It's just a little more than 2 weeks until the presidential election, and we decided to schedule the workshop for now with that in mind. and focus on learning more about policies that have been the subject of wide debate and very divisive rhetoric during this election, and learn more about their impact on families. So the 4 areas we're going to focus on today is the fall of Roe versus Wade and changes to abortion law, the rise of anti-LGBTQ legislation, student debt, and immigration. And we've brought together leading scientists studying this topic from a variety of disciplinary perspectives. You can see them listed in the program, and I'm very excited about many of the speakers, all the speakers pretty much, that we have today. So in each panel, people are going to give their 5-minute presentation, and hopefully we'll have a chance for some questions for each panel. I'm going to ask people who are presenting to remember to speak into the microphone so that the video could capture you. And finally, before we get started, I just wanted to thank some people. First, the UMBC Sociology, Anthropology, and Public Health Department, who've been so gracious in helping me plan this event. And I first and foremost want to thank Sarah Glorioso, our admin for the department, who sent about 1,000 emails and made numerous phone calls to do all the logistical things of setting up this conference. I also want to thank Bambi Chapin and Sarah Chard, the chair and the former chair of our department, who also helped with planning. Next, I'd like to thank Jennifer Glass, the executive director of CCF, who did a lot of logistical things on the CCF end, and our workshop program committee, Fenaba Addo, Shauna Cooper, John Hughes, Richard Petz, Luke Russell, Steve Russell, Elena Van Stee, and Alicia Walker, and I was also on it and chaired it, who helped with a lot of planning for the event. And there were many additional CCF board members who served on other iterations of the committee to rethink the conference format, including the president of the board, Sarah Shoppy Sullivan, who I remember being the person to first propose we move into a more hands-on workshop format. And finally, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, including the Council on Contemporary Families, UMBC, who allowed us to hold the event here, UMBC Sociology, Anthropology, and Public Health Department, the Center for Social Science Scholarship, the Drescher Center for the Humanities. At Johns Hopkins, we also have co-sponsors in the Department of Sociology and the Hopkins Population Center. And finally, at the University of Maryland, our co-sponsor, the Maryland Population Research Center. So that's all the thank yous, and now we're going to turn to our first panel on abortion in the post-Dobbs era, and I'm going to turn it over to our presider, Jennifer Glass.
Okay, you definitely don't need to clap for me because I'm not speaking here. I'm just going to be the timekeeper. So what I'm going to do is announce each presentation, and then you'll come up to the podium. I will give you 5 minutes, so you will get a 2-minute warning, a 1-minute warning, and then a 0. And then I will come up like they do at the Oscars and just nudge you away from the microphone at that point so that we can get through everything. So again, this is the first panel. This is abortion in the post-Dobbs era. And our first presentation is Navigating Intersectional Barriers, Abortion Access and Family Planning for Immigrants in the Current Legal Landscape. And our presenter is Sameera Nayak, who's an assistant professor of public health in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Public Health at UMBC.
Keeping my own time too. Okay, I might have to adjust this a little since I'm significantly smaller than Ariel. Okay, thank you so much. I'm a little nervous to be the first person here, but that's okay. I'll get it out of the way. Before I get started, I did want to acknowledge that this work is funded by a grant from the Society of Family Planning, and a lot of it was conceptualized during a series of workshops I was really lucky to be a part of through the RAND Corporation. So we know that states are critical regulators of family planning services, particularly since the fall of Roe v. Wade. A lot of legislation around, IVF, contraception, and of course abortion is happening at the state level. Even in Maryland, we have a question on the ballot that we'll be voting on very shortly. We also know that this is very similar to when we're thinking about immigration. So although there are federal immigration policies that regulate who comes into the country, a lot of immigrant experiences are regulated by the states that they live in, right? And so when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about everything from like health insurance to driver's licenses to enforcement. Your experience as an immigrant in the US is defined in many ways by the state that you live in. And so existing research on the health implications of these policies has tended to be siloed. And by that, I mean we have folks who have been looking at the different health and well-being impacts of restrictive state-level immigration policies and then restrictive abortion policies, oftentimes separately. So here are some examples. And so many times they're looking at similar outcomes and similar things, but sort of thinking about them as two separate things. However, if you are an immigrant who's making decisions about family formation, fertility, family planning, you're not making those decisions in a siloed manner, right? So you are thinking about both the context of immigration in your state and then also the context of abortion and family planning and reproductive rights in your state. And so your health and well-being and decision-making about your family and yourself is really governed by these two things at the same time. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is a project that we're just starting. And so when we were thinking about this problem, I want you to think about working backwards. So if we think about our ultimate goal as ensuring that immigrants have safe, affordable, equitable, high-quality reproductive health and abortion services. That's our ultimate goal. Before we do that, we have to understand what's going on. So what are the policies that are the most impactful in both the domain of immigration and the domain of reproductive rights, and how are they working together? And that'll help us figure out which policies we'd want to tweak, we'd want to intervene on to have the maximum impact. But what we realized is before we can do that, we have to figure out what the policies are. And so the current research that we're just beginning is sort of a problem scoping effort. So it's conducting a policy scan of all of the state level immigration policies and the state level abortion and reproductive rights policies to then kind of categorize where each state falls using a 4-quadrant framework. If you're like, what does immigration policy or abortion policy mean? These are the types of things. So we're talking about all the different facets that impact immigrants' lives and that also impacts people's reproductive health. So we're just getting started. We've identified a really good data set for us to map abortion policies. But our big challenge right now is trying to find something similar for immigration. So there's a lot of good data from 2019, 2020, but it has been a challenge to find something more recent. Both these domains shift very rapidly, right? So every week there's a new thing. And then obviously with the outcome of this election, that's going to have a big impact as well. However, our goal is to end up with something like this, where we're able to put each state on both axes of like inclusion, exclusion on immigration, and then sort of permissive, restrictive abortion to figure out where each state falls. And then that will help us figure out which states we can target to collect the data that we need to fulfill our ultimate goal of, I should put one more slide. Ultimate goal of providing safe, affordable, equitable, and high-quality abortion and family planning services for immigrants. So I think I did great on time. If you have ideas, collaboration, or like, I have a data set, we're doing that, please email me. And then I always end with a picture of my dogs on their birthday because they're adorable. And since we're talking about some depressing topics, you should also enjoy their adorableness. Thank you.
Our next presenter is going to be speaking on contested personhood in abortion legislation, proposed winners and losers. Our speaker is Aubrey Jackson-Soler, Associate Professor and Associate Chair of the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Public Health at UMBC.
So good morning. I'm Aubrey Jackson-Solar, and I'm a local sociologist here at UMBC. And I'm excited to share with you today some work that's in progress on the conceptualization of personhood in proposed abortion legislation, and what I somewhat facetiously refer to as the winners and losers in those texts. So just to kind of orient ourselves, we often hear about the legislation that has actually been enacted, but those are just a small sliver of what's actually being brought forward by legislators. My review of abortion legislation reveals that bill provisions ranged from what abortion providers must report to the state, to what procedures are prohibited and under what circumstances, to things like what you can and can't do with fetal tissue, neonatal palliative care, and fetal death certificates. Regarding personhood, the thing that I noticed were that women were conspicuously absent or sidelined in the text of these bills, and that begged the question, who matters in the legal construction of abortion? So what does it mean for one's personhood to be recognized by the law? So let's take women as an example. Empirically, we can consider whether women are even mentioned in the text of abortion bills, and if so, whether they're the subjects or the targets of bill provisions. More broadly, when the law recognizes women, it sees them, their circumstances, and their interests as relevant to the state, and this historically hasn't been the case for women. Men traditionally have been the persons that are recognized by the state, and women have been relegated to the home and the domain of their husbands or male kin. But when women are acknowledged as legal persons, then they're subject to state rather than household authority. Granted, both may lean towards patriarchal control, but an important distinction is the rule-based generic authority of formal law. And formal law, especially in the US context, treats persons as agentic individuals that are sometimes regulated by the state and other times protected from state interference, and who are entitled to civil and some social rights. But when women's personhood is not recognized by the law, then their lived experiences are considered extraneous. They're framed as passive bystanders to exercises of state authority, and they're excluded from state entitlements. Sorry. So with this in mind, my research seeks to answer two questions. One, if not women, then who are the relevant persons in abortion bills? And two, what are the implications of this invisibility for women, who are the ones actually at risk of pregnancy, miscarriage, abortion, childbirth, and motherhood? So I'm exploring these questions in a critical discourse analysis of bills proposed in Maryland and Texas immediately before and after the 2022 Dobbs Supreme Court decision. And in this very brief presentation, I'll present two examples from Maryland, which on the whole tends to be more pro-choice leaning than Texas. Okay, so the first example comes from a bill that broadly restricts abortion past the detection of fetal cardiac activity. And it stipulates enforcement through, quote, civil action initiated by any private individual. That might sound a little bit familiar to Texas legislation. And what I want to point out is just one excerpt from this bill, and it explicitly excludes the, quote, consent of the unborn child's mother as a defense to performing, inducing, or even aiding or abetting the performance or inducement of an abortion. So this idea that she is irrelevant highlights women's sidelining not only in terms of their interests, but also in terms of just recognizing them as their own persons. They're just the unborn child's mother. I also found that several provisions exempt a woman and other persons who procure prohibited abortions from civil and criminal liability. And this is true of Texas legislation as well. We can think of this as a protective measure for women, but in doing so, it also construes them as less agentic in the process of terminating a pregnancy, as though it happens to them or around them by malevolent abortionists. Importantly, these liability exemptions do so in the context of restricted access and resources necessary to actually procure the abortion. So whether they're actually entitled to reproductive choice is questionable at best. And as Catherine McCann notes, a coat hanger is not a right. So in conclusion, my research explores how social status and reproductive justice are construed at the nexus of politics, special interests, and legal discourse. And I encourage scholars to consider what policies say about key social groups, even when they say nothing at all. Thank you.
Thanks. Our third speaker is going to be talking on abortion information and the internet. And this will be done by Carole McCann, Professor of Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. So please join me in welcoming her.
Guidance on how I find my PowerPoint? Okay. Okay, thanks. All right. So I actually, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
You're going to start the slideshow.
As my students always remind me. Okay. My research is actually on the focuses on the history of reproductive health, which may seem tangential to this conference. But what I want to talk about today is a community action project that I've been involved in over the last year and a half that endeavors to bring local history to reproductive justice work by engaging with internet sources, particularly Wikipedia. So as others have mentioned, in the post-Dobbs era, abortion fully reverts to the states, and yet it's very hard to find specific and accurate information about state-level policies. And information is fragmented across many different news sources and organizations, websites, and it's also difficult to find history around information about local history as well. And then finally, those who oppose abortion have been seeding the internet with a lot of misinformation about abortion access and abortion services. So I actually want to thank, the PowerPoint is entirely the product of my collaborators, because they're very good at this. So Alicia Polignesi, who is in the Medicine and Humanities program at Hopkins. So what we did is a small group of us came together, academics. I served as sort of an expert academic with the group, and community members to address information gaps through improving the accuracy of information about state-level law on Wikipedia. And why Wikipedia? Because when you Google, what you often get are these featured snippets, and so it's really important that the first couple of lines on the Wikipedia entry is accurate. In 2019, a group of women digital activists called Women in Red had created STEM sort of template for abortion in every state, but didn't any, and it looked like this when we found it. So it had the template in terms of the contents is there, but very little information, and most of it nationally focused in terms of rates and things. And so once these are up, then it's up to the Wikipedia community to customize and fill in the information. There was also examples of bad faith editing since 2019 that had been added, so information about violence against pregnancy crisis centers, but not information about violence against abortion and family planning providers. And that's where we came in. So after the Dobbs decision, we reached out to community groups and individuals interested in reproductive health, rights, and justice for a Wikipedia edit-a-thon. We did it as a fundraiser for our local abortion action fund, and that's what it's called, the Baltimore Abortion Fund, that provides material and financial support for abortion seekers. We came together at the local Radical bookstore, Red Emma's, and what we did is we provided the tools and training for people to become Wikipedia editors, which was not a common thing among reproductive justice activists. We provided the sources that they could look at and add accurate information about abortion in Maryland and history. I think this is really important because the internet is a place where young people who have suffered more from Dobbs in terms of declining access as people who need a ride to another state because they don't have a driver's license and the increasing costs. But also it allowed us to get the history of illegal abortion and abortion legalization in the state so that it's less a view of, oh, there was Roe and now there's Dobbs and there was nothing else, right? So one of the things that's important about Maryland abortion history that I think is important for people to know is that in the 30s through the 50s, we had 3 Baltimore area physicians who routinely provided abortion care in the frame of exceptions for the life and health of the mother. So that's a kind of history that I think is important to get out. So if we worked through a platform that supports Wikipedia edit-a-thons, art and feminism. The final takeaways, people felt empowered. A lot of people who had never been editors were invested in editing about reproductive health on the internet. Some people preferred to get the training and then do the editing at home. And since then, the one final takeaway, you have to cite things. Every piece of information in Wikipedia has to have a citation. There's not a lot of published information on local, so scholars need to start publishing information so that we can then cite it on Wikipedia. And we've been doing more of these edit-a-thons and doing conference presentations about it to try and encourage other people to think of this as a form of publicly engaged scholarship.
So we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. If there are people that would like to ask questions of the speakers, I'm happy to facilitate and field those.
People might have questions more if you could bring them.
You want us to come up, speakers?
About the digital activism. You train people to do this.
Yes.
Does one need to be trained to do this, or could people in this room go on Wikipedia and figure out how to correct things that are inaccurate?
You need the training to be able to get into Wikipedia to edit, right? So there are rules, and of course there's their own code and click structure and abbreviations and things like that to put information in. So people need the training, but it's not hard. I mean,
do people get training if they're not part of your project?
That's a good question, but there are local Wikipedians There are people all over the country who are invested in Wikipedia editing. The National Women's Studies Association has a partnership with Wikipedia to try and, deal with the gender problems with Wikipedia. So I think that if you were to look around, you could find easily. And there are also, I'm sure, YouTube videos on how to.
Coming for the microphone for questions.
I just have a question. I don't know if you're aware, but students are really adept at using artificial intelligence to write essays and generate text. But I wonder if AI could be useful for both training to learn the ins and outs of editing Wikipedia pages, but also just finding information. But I guess more broadly, have you thought about how to integrate AI for your research, for understanding, analyzing the text of a bill, or finding the information, way to phrase it, or the connection between immigration and abortion access?
I have not, but I did try and use ChatGPT to reorganize my reproductive justice syllabus when I had to shift meeting patterns, and it took the politics out.
So I used, so I code with Atlas GI, and I did use, they have some new AI features, I'm guessing it's not at the forefront compared to other platforms. But in looking through legislation, which is kind of tedious, it does give you kind of a decent summary. It's still, thankfully, still useful because it doesn't do everything I need. but it is nice. That's something might be relevant as you look through immigration law.
Yeah, I was going to counterpoint. So when Dr. McCann showed the slide with the Wikipedia snippets, lately on mine, Google Chrome at least, it has like a new AI generated, and it's often wrong. So when we were trying to looking for abortion immigration, it would be pulling from like random websites, and I would read it and I'm like, I'm 90% sure that is not correct. And then you like go in a deep dive, so I don't know. I'm still a little bit less trusting of. I think it would be a good place to maybe start, but I feel like I'd still have to like go and verify everything.
I think that's a good place for educators, is not just teaching the content, but how to look for content is really key, given that it's very easy to read those summaries and not look into the sources.
And I think for abortion specifically, the crisis pregnancy centers and the information they publish can really become problematic because it sounds like what you're looking for, but as we know, it's not probably what you're looking for.
I think also, given the topics that we're talking about today, to think about the impact of AI and any of those, there are some real environmental consequences for, every ChatGPT search, it uses a lot of energy, a lot of water. We're here talking about immigration, abortion, LGBTQ rights, and student debt, and maybe climate change is something that we should be concerned about. So I actually think I've been reading a little bit about people who are refusing to use AI as much as they can as a sort of their own environmental activism. And they actually said that is something that is more appealing to their college students and please don't cheat. And so if you're trying to get your students to not use ChatGPT, you might want to talk to them about climate change, and that might make them be less likely to use it.
I have a question about, I love how you look at policies and legislatures, but what you're looking at is in some ways the end product, what the legislature and the policies is. But how do you account for the process and the negotiation, all the committee fights, the arguments for getting to that language? And I'm wondering how you handle that part of, there's that final product. I love the grid, putting the states in there, but then there's the negotiation, on the way there. Same thing with looking at what the language of the laws say.
Yeah, I feel like when I was listening to Aubrey talked, I was like, we should do something together because you're working on that piece and I'm working on the end product. But yeah, since we are still trying to figure out the end product, we haven't quite got there. But I think that's an excellent point, and perhaps something we work in the same department. So
there's Texas is a really great example where you'll have a lot of bills proposed and maybe less than 5% get enacted. And what you see are a lot of bills being proposed year after year with small changes. So you do see a process and you see language or different provisions borrowed. So even, I've just looked at the legislative text, not like committee hearing notes and things like that. And most bills die in committee, overwhelming majority. But you do kind of get a sense of this, conventions of how you talk about things. And that's kind of what I'm interested in. So in that aspect, I mean, that kind of gets at the process. I had a graduate student who looked at some more of that, like the committee hearings and that process, but it is, and that's why I like looking at proposed legislation, is you get a sense of what are the ideas out there that people are vying to get into the law, to make normal, to make legally relevant, those ideas about personhood, about health, about the unborn life, and all of these things about the state's responsibility to protect whomever. And so you do see that kind of evolve and things established as normal. And then you also see this kind of buy-in from legislators who choose to author those bills, even though they don't get passed. And you get to see if they get to show support, like, oh, I put forward 10 bills that are like this. And so I think that does get some of that, kind of how that's being constructed. That Maryland bill did not pass. But it's kind of borrowing that language from Texas of that private enforcement of bills. And so you do see that diffusion across states as well.
Thank you.
I was just wondering if you're also tracking ALEC and the state policy legislative network. I mean, like where the big money builds the bills in these bill mills that then get pushed out. I mean, I think it's really, I'm very fascinated by, the dark money network that is just totally corrupting our political process.
I haven't looked at that. I think that's really fascinating. I think there's a lot of potential of network analysis looking at even just legislators themselves who, who's co-authoring or endorsing bills, and how does that overlap, and where does abortion fit into that? Is it special, or is it just kind of a partisan issue? I think certainly involving kind of the money for these things, or the different think tanks that are the ones who literally are writing, I say authoring these bills, but I don't imagine they're actually authoring them. So who are kind of generating this content, writing these bills. I haven't looked into that, but that is certainly something I think is very important and really speaks to what are the special interests that are actually putting forward these ideas and trying to get them, into law, and the legitimacy and the importance that the law can kind of convey on those ways of thinking about issues. And so that's certainly something that I've thought about but not started. But and what's really nice is that these are kind of public documents. A lot of it is publicly available, and so it's just a matter of kind of compiling and figuring out how to put them together. But yeah, I think that would be fascinating.
yeah, I think sometimes with the money though, it takes time to track it to the source, and that's purposeful.
Follow up to one of your earlier questions. You were talking about the language developing and patterns. I was wondering if you've noticed any patterns, whether that language is developing mostly uniformly across the country, or if there's different language, say in states with post-Dobbs bans versus not, or red versus blue, or any other of those patterns between states are different.
I've just looked at Texas and Maryland, actually mostly at Texas. Yeah, it's not the same. Just a very kind of straight example. So my research kind of focuses on ideas about patriarchy and mostly looking at kind of men versus women dynamic, but that of course is not the entirety of how gender is involved in this issue. And I noticed that Maryland, for example, changed a lot of statutes to say pregnant persons rather than women, and kind of did that. And Texas hasn't. But I actually just came across a recent bill that it was just kind of like an afterthought, your gender identity does not exclude you from any of these provisions, like it still applies to you. You know, it's kind of a like, we're going to keep our language, but also, you know, anyone who's female, you know. So, you know, that's just a very stark example, but different. A lot more, actually across the board, more pro-life bills proposed, but more pro-choice in Maryland, and the ones that were actually enacted during this time period in Maryland were all pro-choice. The ones that were actually enacted in Texas were all pro-life. So it is, there's overlap for sure, but there are also some differences.
I hope we can continue these conversations during our break, but right now it's time to move on to our second panel. Great segue on anti-LGBTQ legislation.